Hello and welcome to the Invention Studio embroidery software training video. In this video I'm going to be showing you guys how to use Hatch to take an image and turn it into something that can actually be embroidered on our Brother embroidery machine. Again, we're going to be working in Hatch Embroidery 2, that's this software right here. And when you first open up Hatch, you're going to be in this Manage Designs panel right here. In here we can see some interesting stuff like other people have made their designs, but we are not super interested in that. We are trying to make our own design, so we're going to come to the left here and open the Artwork tab. To start embroidery, all you need is an image. It can be a PNG or a JPEG, but before we even consider putting in the image, we need to tell the software what machine we're using and what hoop we're using. To do that, we're going to come up here to the top where it says hoop, and if I right-click this, it pulls up the machine and hoop menu. We are going to be using the Brother Entrepreneur PR650, so just remember that number PR650 and you should be able to find this. And then once you select the machine, the hoops will auto-populate. The hoops that you can use are these top four, and the only relevant information is the information in the parentheses. So you can see 60 by 40, 100 by 100, so on. That is the working area in millimeters that you have for each of your hoops. So just for the sake of example, I'll go ahead and click the 180 by 130 and click OK, and you'll see this red box in the main panel update. Once you have your machine and hoop set up, to actually insert your image, we're going to go to the Artwork tab and click Insert Artwork. I am going to just pick something already saved on here, and we'll do this little fox. And immediately we see that it's too large, so we need to resize the image. We don't need to get everything in the red hoop, just the parts of the image that we want to embroider. So what I mean by that is I could do something like this, where even though the gray is outside of the red, the body of the fox is all within it, so it's fine. Now, I don't really like looking at this grid pattern here. It can be useful to know exactly how large your things are, because each one of these squares is a 1 centimeter square. But I don't need to be too precise today, so over here, where I clicked hoop before to define the machine and hoop, there's also this template button. I can click that to hide the template and restore it the same way. There's also the grid you can pop up for like the entire design panel. I personally think those look a little messy, so I just don't use them. So, I showed you that you could resize by dragging the corners, and that's all well and good, but what if you want more precise control? We also have these options at the top for width and height. You can type in exact numbers here, and so long as this lock icon here is closed, your aspect ratio will be preserved. So as I type in larger numbers for width, it scales the height automatically. And I can do the same thing with these percentages. So if I want it to be half the size it is now, I type in 50% and it'll scale like that. So we'll leave it something like that. Seems fine to me. Okay. The image is not quite ready to be digitized, which is the process of turning it from an image to embroidery objects. Before we do that, we need to go through a step called preparing the artwork for embroidery. Essentially, the way Hatch is going to be generating objects is by defining color boundaries, and to do that it needs to have very clear edges between two different colors. But we can see in this image, like for example over here, we have these gradients, and then along the edges they're kind of fuzzy as well. There's some anti-aliasing going on there. Both of those things will confuse Hatch a little bit, so we have to go through this prepare artwork for embroidery step to get rid of all those gradients basically. So if I deselect the image here, you'll see that prepare artwork for embroidery is grayed out. To get it to actually work, I just need to select the image by left-clicking it, and then I can do prepare artwork for embroidery. This pulls up the panel that we see here, and in here we need to do a whole bunch of reduction of the color space. So we can see that this image is currently composed of 45 colors, and all these tiles here are individual hues that Hatch has found, and it is basically trying to ask us what should be considered the same color. If I click one of these tiles and then I hold down locate with the left click button, we can see that this is all of that tile in the image. And then over here, if I can click another different orange, that's that orange in the image. So the basic process of this reduction process is going to be to select multiple colors and then merge them based on if they're basically the same thing. So like this orange and this orange, I mean all the oranges really, I would probably consider combining because I don't really need the shadows. I would use the control button to select multiple tiles, and then when you have multiple selected like this, you can actually locate all of them at the same time just to verify that they're the correct thing. And now when I click merge, they all become this one orange tile. Now this image actually has quite a lot of colors in it, so one thing you can do to sort of brute force and pray that it works is just use this down here, the automatic reduction feature. If I just spam this or like put it down to 10 or something, and then usually I have to click the arrow for it to update, it actually does a pretty good job. The danger with using this feature to drop your color space too quickly is if I go to like 3 or something, the image loses a lot of detail, and just as an extreme example, if I go even lower, you can start to see incorrect merges like that. So I'm going to pop this back up to like 12 because that seemed okay, and then that's sort of my rough pass of what it should be. There is some weird splotchiness happening, especially in the ears and the feet a little bit. But that'll be things that we address with later object generation tools. For now, I'm going to simplify it how I think it should be, which is probably just going to be merging all of these oranges, except for that one. So I'm going to merge these, because they all seem to be sort of the same thing. And then this gray is some of the tail and some of the background. We can go ahead and merge these. And this process is highly subjective. This is basically just how you want your image to look. So coming back from the cut, this is what I have reduced the fox to. You can see that I've actually lost a lot of detail here, so some of that I'm going to be restoring. For example, the interior of the ears, the tail, and the mouth, they look pretty gray right now. I'm probably going to want it to be lighter, probably like white, but that's something I'll be able to do manually later, so I'm not too worried. My main concern is just making sure that we have clear boundaries between the colors and I have all the different colors I want. So these seem sectioned off relatively how I want them, and so now when I click OK, you're going to see this image turn into this flattened blob-like thing here. And now there's very clear boundaries between the colors, so Hatch will be able to digitize this well. There are a few different ways we're going to be generating objects. The first way is going to be this tab below artwork called Auto-digitize. Auto-digitize is going to use those color boundaries we just set up to create objects, and the easiest way to demonstrate what this is by just kind of using some buttons that I don't recommend you use all the time. When I select the image, like this, these two buttons at the top here light up. These buttons will automatically interpret what Hatch thinks you want your patch to look like. So if I just click this, it'll create objects for everything. And you can see that it's not quite perfect, like it missed the tail and the ears and the mouth, but we can start to see these embroidery objects. This is what we are trying to create in this section. These are what the machine reads and actually knows how to embroider. The image itself doesn't really do anything. The reason I say you shouldn't use the auto-digitize instant embroidery function is because it kind of restricts your creativity. Like, you can use it as a starting point and then edit from there if you want, but I personally find that doing everything manually gives you more control and you can decide more what you want. So, moving beyond those, the next 5 options here are the core of auto-digitizing, and they all sort of work the same way but do slightly different things. If I use click to fill, I'll just select it and then highlight over parts of the image. You can see that that cross-hatching pattern shows me what all is the same color, so that when I click, it generates an object. You can do this for anything in the image really, so a very sort of basic, naive approach to making a patch would just be to go through and sort of click everything, and eventually you'd have enough to make your design. But we are going to explore some of the other tools because some of them are a little nicer to use for specific types of shapes. Right under click to fill, we have click to fill without holes. This feature is kind of intuitive based on the name. Basically, it fills in interior contours, so you can see that whereas before it left holes for the eyes and nose, now it has filled those in. This tool is useful for establishing like base layers of stitches. So if you ever want to create a mildly 3D pattern, you can put things under things. So like I could do the entire background and then embroider everything else on top of it so that I could get like a sort of 3D thing. The other thing that doing the entire background is helpful for is avoiding color separation problems. Something that's a sort of common theme of embroidery is trying to avoid warping in your fabric, because every time you're making a stitch, it's squeezing the fabric a little bit. So over time, over thousands of stitches, you can start to misalign certain shapes, and you'll see between adjacent objects into your fabric. By establishing this base layer of stitches, we avoid that problem, because if two objects start to separate a little bit, rather than seeing the fabric, you'll just see this black base layer. So for a cartoony object like this, that honestly will just probably look normal. If you wanted to do something like that, you'd probably need to hide this. So I'm just right-clicking it here and then clicking hide. It still exists. If I open up the sequence, we can still see the black object here, and I can unhide it, and it comes back. But the reason we're hiding it is just so that we can continue digitizing on top of it. Now, that was click to fill without holes. Next is turning fill. Turning fill is a very interesting tool. What it does is adapts your stitch angle to be perpendicular to the center line of whatever object you're digitizing. So it does really good on outlines like that. It'll find a very clear center line and give you some perpendicular stitch angles, or like the eyes here, it'll do well. But something like the face, where it doesn't really have a clear center line, it's gonna look real weird. Or like the butt here, it kind of does okay, because there's a sort of clear arc to this shape. Tail, it'll do alright as well. But yeah, you can see for like big open areas, it doesn't understand what it's supposed to do super well. That can be further demonstrated using the click to center line tool, which is 2 down. You can see, yeah, the center line is just the outline for these, which is why I was sort of following that before. But this one has a clear center line, this one has a center line up until this part. And then there's the outline tool. Outline will just make one single stitch around the outside for anything. Some people like the way this looks. It looks a little artsy, so, you know, it can be kind of nice. So yeah, that is the major 5 auto-digitize functions. The last thing we should go over in this menu is the smooth shapes option. Smooth shapes is for when you have jagged objects. Like when we did the prepare arc for embroidery step, we had these jagged edges that showed up. So if I digitize this, it doesn't look super clean. Smooth shapes can help me with that. Now, to get out of the click to fill tool, just now, I went up here to the top left and I clicked select. I need to do that so that I can actually select the object in order to use the smooth shapes tool. So with an object selected, I can click smooth shapes. And then we get this precision dialog here. The higher this precision is, the more circular it's going to make my object, and the lower the precision, the finer details it's going to need to see to start smoothing anything. So to demonstrate that, if I make this really, really small, then it basically does nothing. Like the outline hasn't changed at all. But if I make it really big, then it makes it a little bit of an overcorrection. It's super circular now. Somewhere in between, probably like 0.01 inches or something, it starts to look a little bit more normal. We can see it's smoothing out some of those jagged edges. Let's pop it a little bit more sensitive, and we get something like that. That seems like too much to me. But yeah, you can imagine you sort of play with this precision until you get what you want. That looks about right to me. So we just went through all the options within Auto-digitize, and I was undoing everything as I went because I wasn't really sure what I want the design to look like yet. A major theme throughout this section of object generation is that everything I'm showing you are tools that you can use, but you don't have to use any of them. This is all sort of just like artistic preference, like however you want your design to look is what you should be doing. So for example, I don't really want this base layer, so I'm just going to delete it. And then this object, I'm going to delete it for now as well. I don't super need it. But yeah, after auto-digitize, we're going to move into the next way you can generate objects. So this way was kind of nice when we could get a nice flattened image like this, but there are cases where you can't flatten an image. And for those cases, rather than working in this auto-digitize tab, we're going to go 2 down, below edit objects, to the digitize tab. Digitize is where you can manually create any sort of object that you can think of. First of all, you have your basic shape tools up here. So like if I do a rectangle, I can click here and click here, and then I create this rectangle. I can also create other shapes, circles. If I click here, I create the center. I can define the radius, and then right now it's asking me to define a secondary radius. I don't have to do this. If I click enter right now, it'll just make a circle. But if I do define a second radius, I can create an ellipse. And then you have your basic shapes here as well. One thing you will have noticed when I generated these shapes is that they auto-digitized as green. If you want to color match parts of your image, the easiest way to do that is going to actually be to auto-digitize part of it. So like if I click to fill this, now I have digitized that section, and the reason we did that is because it popped up a color down here. This color bar is how you change the color of objects. So if I click this thing and then I click one of these colors, it changes colors. And the reason I had to auto-digitize part of the tail is because these first 15 colors are all Hatch defaults. But these last 3 were actually generated when I was auto-digitizing earlier. So if I Control Z a bit, you can see that number 18 disappeared there. I clicked filling, that orange comes back. So now I can select my rectangle, click the orange that generated, and now these are the exact same color. And that was also a good time to mention that the colors in Hatch don't actually matter that much, as long as you know what color the design is supposed to be in the end, because what's going to determine the color of your patch is not what it says in software, but rather the color of the thread that you put onto the machine. The machine isn't checking to make sure that you put the right color on, it's just kind of trusting that you know what you're doing. So if I wanted this rectangle to be like purple or something, I could do it here, but I could also like make it white, and then as long as I put on a purple thread onto the machine, this rectangle will end up the right color. Now, the shape tools are all well and good, but the more powerful thing you can do in the Digitize tab is actually define objects on your own. Before, when we did auto-digitize, it created objects like this, and if I quickly pop into the reshape tool, we can see that objects are made out of nodes. We have a combination of these blue circles and these yellow squares up here, if I can grab it. Yeah. So, these nodes define the object. In the circular nodes, you can see that the outline sort of curves through them, and in the square nodes, it makes a hard corner at them. We also have these orange squares here. These are going to define your stitch angle. I'll be going more in depth about the reshape tool later, so don't worry if you didn't follow all of that. Just basically the idea that objects are made out of nodes will be relevant in a second here. We can define our own shapes using the Digitize tab, and that's helpful because sometimes when you import your image, this flattening step doesn't really work. Like when I opened the Fox originally, there was about 50 different colors, which was kind of a lot. It's sort of on the border of what I would consider reasonable to prepare art for embroidery with. For photorealistic things or just more complicated designs, maybe there's weird lighting in the room or something, you might start to see like 300 unique colors. If that's the case, it's really hard to do the prepare artwork step without losing a ton of detail. So instead of doing that, you can just have a basic image and then trace it. To trace parts of the image, we have the freehand options and the digitize options. The freehand option is going to be a lot harder to use, but I will demonstrate it. I select freehand close shape here. The first thing I'm going to do is actually check up here to make sure that we're on fill, because if I'm on outline, then it'll create an outline, which is not what I want. So I'll make sure it's on fill. And then what I can do is use my mouse, holding left click and dragging. I can try and trace the border of a shape, and in that way create an embroidery object. Now, I actually did okay there, but you can see that it's not perfect. Like, the border is sort of seeping into the gray here, and we missed some of the black down here. It's very difficult to do objects, especially larger ones, freehand. So like for example, if I tried to trace like the whole face here, this is much harder. Like I've already messed up on that arc there, I went too far there. You can imagine doing this for the entire design is going to be really difficult, especially when you get to more complicated pictures. So rather than doing all that, like yeah, you can see how messy these edges got. Rather than doing that, we can use the digitize options. And this is where those nodes that I was pointing out earlier come in. The digitize option doesn't require you to trace, it rather defines, or it requires you to define the nodes that generate an object. So I can create objects by clicking sequentially like this, and then when I click enter, it will connect the first and last node. Just now, those were all corner nodes, those yellow squares that I was showing you earlier, but if I start right-clicking, this has all been left-clicking, if I start right-clicking, it'll create curved nodes. So I can use any combination of right and left click to create an object, and then Hatch will solve for it. If you are digitizing and you go like one too deep and you want to get rid of a node, you can click backspace and it will get rid of the last node in the sequence. You can also click escape to get rid of everything. But yeah, to actually show you the practical use case of this, I'm going to do the gray of the tail here. This is a corner here, so I'll left click, and then I'll use a bunch of right clicks along this arc here. So I'll just kind of work my way up, and you can see that I can move wherever I want, and it doesn't matter if my hand is unsteady, because I can just right click a whole bunch as soon as I have my cursor in the right position. And this is just, you know, a somewhat slow process, but I'll just click the border a whole bunch until eventually I have my object. Okay, so now you can see I've defined all the nodes. The border is not perfectly tracking, but it's a lot closer than when I was tracing it with the freehand option. So yeah, that looks a lot closer than what the other things looked like. And now again, obviously I need to recolor this. I said earlier I wanted it to be a lighter white, so I'll just make it white using the Hatch default there. And that looks nice. There's one more way to generate objects, which is going to be for specifically doing letters and words, and that is going to be up here in the lettering and monogramming tab above artwork. A common thing that people will try to do is import an image that has text in it and then try and auto-digitize it. But you probably don't want to do that, because if you do that, all your stitches are going to be sort of uniform in the same direction. Or maybe you want to use like turning fill and it might work, but then the intersections are going to look weird. You can get much cleaner looking lettering by just using this lettering tool here. So if I open that up and then type in something, we get this text here, and you can immediately see why you want to use the lettering tool. It's actually adapting the stitch angle in the same way that turning fill would, except it's crossing over as if it was doing like another pen stroke. So it looks a lot cleaner that way, especially at intersections. And you also have a lot more customizability within the lettering tab. So first of all, we have like our font type. I can change this to all sorts of different things. I kind of liked the Algerian one, so I'll go back to that. Instead of font size, like 32 point or 72 point or something, we actually have just an actual height. So if I wanted an inch tall, I just type in an inch and it becomes an inch tall. I'll put it down to 0.5, I think. Next option we have is your baseline. The baseline is what the letters are sitting on. Right now it's just this basic flat thing, but I can curve the text by putting it on a circle. And when you use one of these curved options, down at the bottom, we get an option for the baseline radius. The baseline radius is that radius of the circle that it's sitting on. So if I make the circle really big, then it becomes almost flat. And if I make the circle really small, then it will curve a lot more. So let's pop this at like 1.5. Looks okay. Can move that around a little. I don't know. And just like other objects, you can recolor the letters by clicking these tiles down here, so I can make it black. We have other baseline options, different warping. There's a lot of options you have to modify objects, but I won't be going through everything in this training. Hatch just has a lot of things you can explore with. The other type of letter generation we have is monogramming. And when I open this up, we see all these like compound designs with ABC in them. If I pull one of these in, we can see this combination of all these objects are actually one little thing here. To change what it says in the ABC, I'm going to select the object and then go to the top here where it says letters, and then type in like anything else, PLA, maybe we're 3D printing, who knows, and that'll update that. Now these objects are not like invincible. If I overload it, it'll kind of break, but they might look nice, so you can consider using monogramming if you want. I primarily use the lettering tool, but you can do whatever you want. So I've now digitized everything in a sort of basic way, but there are certain things that I can still modify about my design. And to do that, I'm going to go into this Edit Object tab right here. So below Digitize, below Auto-digitize and above Manual digitize, we have the Edit Objects tab. And in here, we have a bunch of things we can do to change the way each of these objects look a little bit. First of all, we have our Object Properties menu here. If I click that, it actually closes it because it's already open. But if I click it again, it'll open back up. And then it says no properties to display. This is because I need to actually select an object. So I'll do like this mouth part here. And then now we have all sorts of weird stuff we can change. We'll focus on the face first, actually, because it'll be easier to see what I'm modifying. The first sub-menu of Object Properties is basically your stitch fill. The default is tatami with pattern 1. I can scroll through tatami here, and you can see there's a whole bunch of different patterns you can use for this. So you can make it like more coarse, extremely more coarse, different things in here. Default of tatami 1 looks pretty good in my opinion. There is an example cloth on the back yellow wall in Craftland to show you some of the fill types. But yeah, those are all subtypes of tatami. We also have more drastic changes, like if I click satin here in the stitch type, it'll turn into something like this, which almost looks like what turning fill was, but it's not quite the same because the stitch angle is still uniform throughout. 3D satin is exciting. It actually makes your design bubble up a little bit by stacking multiple layers of stitches, but because it's stacking multiple layers, you do have to be careful with more fragile fabrics because it'll just tear them apart. But yeah, we have interesting fill patterns here. These are, again, sort of just like however you want your stitches to look, you pick whatever you like. The second submenu is going to be the effects. You can do all sorts of things in here. Again, not going to go through everything. But like radial fill is cool. You can create little circle patterns like that. Different pattern fills as well. And the final submenu is going to be the stitching menu. Within stitching, I don't touch most of this because the machine knows what it's doing in terms of making stitches. The one exception is this option here, the stitch angle. The angle is just like what direction all the stitches are going, and right now it's 45. I can change this to like 90 if I want, and then everything will go straight up. 180 for everything sideways, things like that. At 180 it loops back to 0. Now, that's the Object Properties menu. We also have Smooth Shapes, which we saw earlier in the Auto-digitize section. We also have the Reshape tool, which I used earlier and said I would explain more, so it's now later. When I click Reshape, we see all the nodes that pull up an object, and we can drag these around to reshape an object if we want. We also have the orange squares here. These define your stitch angle, so I can zoom out a bit here. I can drag these squares around, and as I drag it, there's actually a little like live update of what the angle is, and I can align stitches that way. The primary use for the Reshape tool is going to be getting rid of color separation. So usually when you're embroidering, you don't do your first pass on your fabric that you care about. You'll do like a test pass on one of our scrap fabrics or scrap shirts or something. And then if you notice that there's separation between two colors, like for example, there's maybe space between the top of the face and the outline of the tail here, I could come in here with a Reshape tool and then start dragging these nodes up a little bit to add more overlap, which in the end won't actually look like overlap, it'll just sort of fill in that gap that I saw. So that's one way you can avoid color separation. The other way is going to be just kind of making the entire shape larger. So like if I select this shape, we talked about resizing earlier for the whole image, the same thing applies to embroidery objects. I can come up here and scale this up to like 103 or something, and now there's overlap everywhere. It's sort of hit or miss if this looks good or not, but you can do that as a preliminary step to try and avoid color separation. So yeah, that was the reshape tool and resizing. Next we have adding stitch angles. We already had one stitch angle here, but one interesting thing you can do is actually add multiple. So if I have this object selected and I click add stitch angles, this will allow me to click outside the shape at multiple points, and then if I click enter, it'll give me one stitch angle. If I just do one, it does that, but if I start to add multiple, so we already have one line here, if I do this, and this, and then click enter, then it will sort of arc my stitch angles through those three lines, which is kind of neat. If I want to get rid of all that, the button right below it for remove stitch angles will remove it. I'm going to exit the reshape tool and go back to select because I don't want to look at those nodes right now. So the next tool in edit objects is the knife tool. Knife tool is for splitting objects apart, and this is actually going to use the same node logic we talked about earlier when we were digitizing objects. So with left clicks we'll create straight nodes, right clicks will create curved nodes, and I can do all sorts of weird cuts, and then when I click enter, Hatch will split apart my object. So now I have multiple parts of the face that I can drag around and modify independently. The opposite of the knife tool is the weld tool. So if I want to, I can use the control button to select multiple of these, and then if I click weld, it'll merge them back together. It actually didn't merge them there because there was no overlap between them, so let me try that one more time. I'll, for the sake of example, drag this a little bit deeper in, and now there's definitely overlap between these two. So now when I click weld, they become one object, and their stitch angles are merged, and any properties that I apply to one will apply to both. So I'll just undo until before I even knifed it in the first place. There are more tools within this tab that you can mess with. Again, I'm not going to be going through everything Hatch has to offer in this training just because there's a lot, but yeah, that's sort of what you need to get started. Just quickly, I am going to modify the color of these three gray objects because I want them to be the same white as this tail. And yeah, if I wanted to, I could go in and make some modifications, but I'm not actually going to be embroidering this, so I'm just going to move on to the next part of the training, which is sequencing. The sequence is where we're going to tell Hatch what order we want to embroider all of these objects. So right now they're kind of just like in an arbitrary order, but to see what order the machine thinks they're in right now, we can open the sequence, which is going to be at the bottom of the Edit Objects menu. Right here, I just clicked it, and it actually closed it because it was already open, but if I click it again, it'll open my sequence, and we can see all of these objects that make up the design. So it's going to do this thing first, then the tail, then the letters, and the outline, and so on. This is very suboptimal. When we're sequencing, we have a few different priorities. First of all, we want to reduce the amount of color switching that's happening. So whenever we switch from like black to white, or white to black, or like any color to a different color, the machine has to pause to anchor the current color and then switch to a different needle, which is going to add time to our design if we're doing it way too much. It doesn't matter that much to avoid color switches, especially if avoiding color switches will compromise the integrity of your design, because like our number one concern is just make sure the patch looks good. The two more important things are starting from your most detailed area and working sort of like on adjacent objects near each other in time. So the first part of that is working with your most detailed area first. Whenever you're embroidering, every stitch that you put in the fabric adds a little warping because there's tension in those stitches and they each squeeze a little bit. And over thousands of stitches, this can noticeably warp your fabric by like a millimeter or half a millimeter or something. Because of that, you want to start with our most detailed area so that it looks the best. So for this design, I'd probably want to start with like the facial features and then move outwards. The reason we want to work on adjacent objects sooner rather than later is because let's say, for example, I embroidered like this part of the foot, and then I came up here and I did like the entire tail, and then I came back and tried to do the outline. All the embroidering I did up here for the tail has introduced a ton of warping, and now this object has moved a little bit. So when I try to put the outline over it, it's probably not going to line up super well. So because of that, you want to make sure that you're doing things next to each other sooner, so that as little warping as possible has happened by the time you are trying to embroider that object. So, to actually achieve that, we are going to come over here into the sequence, and the first step we're going to do is just click anything and then do Control A to select everything, so that when I have multiple objects selected, this option here for sequence by color pops up. Then I'm going to just sort of arbitrarily pick these things. What this is going to do is group everything that is the same color together and then put them sequentially. But within color, there might be things that I want to drag around. Like, I want to do the black facial features first, but I don't want to do the outline yet, because that is probably going to do a ton of warping for no reason. So I'll just drag specifically that object to the bottom. So yeah, we're going to do black first, and then we're going to do the orange of the face, and then we're going to do the white here, seems good, and then the brown as well. That seems like a fine order to me. So I'll click OK. It'll reorder things a little bit. And now I just have to do some basic modifications. The first thing that we'll notice in the sequence is that this text is happening pretty early. Anytime you have text or like floating objects like this, it's almost always going to be best to just drag this straight to the bottom, because this is not actually touching anything, meaning that warping won't really affect how it looks. If this ends up being like 0.5 millimeter closer or 0.5 millimeter farther, you won't even be able to tell. So all that embroidering this immediately will do is add more warping for no reason. So for that reason, just do it last. Next, the outline. I also don't want to do this until much later because it's a lot of stitches everywhere for no reason. These are fine. These are fine. Although I kind of want to do these two afterwards. So I'll pull these after that. That's a pretty small nitpicky thing. I don't think it'll matter that much. And then the orange of the face makes sense to do next. I actually feel like the back and tail can probably stand to be done a little bit later. So I'll take these three, and we'll do these after the entire face is done. So I'll put these before the black here. This should be with the rest of the tail. These are fine. That's good. So I'll move this to the rest of the tail. Like there. Move it after that so we can avoid one color switch there. Just to the white. Now the brown is all good. So I went through that sort of just on my own, but I was trying to talk through my thought process of like how I'm thinking about sequencing things. One thing to note with sequencing, whenever you have overlap, the color that's done second is going to be the one that dominates. So like for this color here, we can see that it's sort of buried within the white and the orange, but if I drag that color down all the way to the bottom, it'll become a little bit more prominent. Now you can see it more because there was overlap there. If I undo, it goes back down to between them. So that's another thing you can think about when you're sequencing. For the most part, sequencing is going to have a much more minor effect than the rest of the stuff that I've talked about before in the software, but it is important that you have a somewhat logical sequence or you'll just run into color separation problems. Once you have a good sequence, you're pretty much ready to export and send it to the machine to embroider. I will mention that the image here doesn't actually do anything. So like even if I have it in my sequence here, the machine's not going to see it or pay attention to it. One fun thing to do is just right click it and hide it. This can be helpful in case you miss an object like this. You'll actually see through the image and notice that you've missed it by hiding the image. But yeah, other than that, sequence is done. To export this, I'm going to go to File, Export Design, and I'm going to save this onto a flash drive as a .pes file. So this is just saved to the desktop right now, but in order to get it onto the embroidery machine, you'll need to put it onto a flash drive. We have a few around Craftland, so just grab one and use it. It doesn't matter where you save it on the flash drive as long as you know the file name and where it is. So I'll save, and that's it. That was the end of Hatch software embroidery training.